Thank you so much. And thank you, Ryan and Reggie, for the invitation to join you here today. It's been a really fascinating symposium so far, and I'm thrilled to be sharing this podium with so many of you who have learned so much already today. Especially thankful to be asked as a non-art historian to come talk at an art museum. And so I'm really a cultural historian. I'll be contextualizing the art and objects in museums from a point of view that is not as well trained in the vast canon of art history as many of you are here. That's my just very brief disclaimer. That's only because I've been so impressed with everything you all have said today. I hope you've had a chance to look around upstairs. As you can see, the Biggs has an extraordinary collection of American decorative arts, and I spent quite a bit of time not only upstairs but flipping through the beautiful catalog collection and book of American decorative arts. And if you do that, you'll see lots and lots of pages of brown, lots of furniture, and lots of pages of silver, but not many pages with the rich diversity of women's work, of textiles, of samplers, needlepoint, quilts, and other typically female forms of art that would have been the contemporary objects of the furniture and the silver that you see upstairs. In my talk today, I'd like to discuss how such objects, as well as their more recent descendants, art quilts, fiber art, and feminist art that explicitly draws on and is informed by these traditions, has, with various degrees of success, made its way into American art museums during the last half-century, as well as examine the hierarchies that have existed between forms of women's art and so-called high art. I'll start with a little bit of my own journey into this topic, which is related to my research on the relationship of Amish quilts to the art market, by sharing part of my investigation that reveals the stark hierarchies that have existed between women's work and art in the museum. Here. About 10 years ago, I wanted to find what I imagined was a missing link that proved that abstract minimalist artists like Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Joseph Albers, and others who were painting in bold graphic colors were inspired by Amish quilts. Surely some of these artists must have noticed center diamond and bars quilts hanging on the clotheslines in Lancaster County while they tooled about the countryside, right? I had heard that Frank Stella owned and displayed Navajo blankets, so it didn't seem like that much of a stretch. And buried in an exhibition catalog, I found a reference that Andy Warhol had owned a Lancaster County Amish quilt. But his signature pop art shared much more in common with the repeat block pattern quilts of the dominant culture, rather than the graphic minimalism of Amish quilt makers. But I thought maybe there was some hidden connection. An art historian friend offered me to get a message for me to the Rothko estate, to his children, and I was able to ask if Rothko was familiar with Amish quilts or if the family had ever slept under quilts, and his heir's answer was an adamant no. The signature color field painter was not at all familiar with the craft. Barnett Newman's wife, widow at this time actually, fielded a similar question in the 1970s from a folk art curator who compared her late husband's work to an Amish bars quilt, she stated that his intention was to explore the, quote, subtle relationships between stripe and ground, whereas a quilt maker was, quote, carrying out a simple pattern. Perhaps it would not be in a prominent living artist's best interest to acknowledge being inspired by the artistic work of untrained female artists. The hierarchies between art and craft, between male, trained, fine artists and female needleworkers were rigidly defined in the 1960s and 1970s. A Philadelphia Inquirer review of one of the very first museum exhibitions that was narrowly focused on Amish quilts quoted, "It would probably be difficult to secure loans of paintings from abstract artists if the intention were to show them alongside quilts. Hard-edge abstract painters probably would feel chagrined, I should think, to have their efforts compared with applied arts, albeit excellent, quintessentially American folk arts such as Amish quilts, end quote. But these boundaries began to blur as interest in women's traditional art forms gained prominence, thanks to the feminist movement, the approaching bicentennial in the 1976, and the counterculture's interest in the applied arts and crafts, and an otherwise expanding art canon. Throughout the 60s and 70s, with a renewed interest in folk art, efforts to promote quilt making and other needlework as a viable source of income within impoverished communities, the feminist celebration of traditionally female crafts, and the growing feminist art movement, traditional forms of women's art began to receive newfound attention after years of relegation to attics and cedar chests. The ever-expanding experimentation within high art during the 60s, think of the pop art, minimalism, and performance art, some of the art forms we just saw in the previous presentation, sorts of new media, had made room for new definitions of art to continue to emerge, and this began to slowly find its way into museums. The Museum of Modern Art first showed an exhibit of fiber-based work in 1969 called Wall Hangings, and it featured woven works within the context of high art rather than as craft objects. And at least 4 museums throughout the late 60s and 70s began to present quilts in an art context. This one actually not even in the late 60s. In 1960, we have Brooklyn Museum's American Quilts and Coverlets. In 1965, the New York City's Museum of Contemporary Crafts, which is now known as the Museum of Art and Design, exhibited fabric collage, which was featured 19th century American quilts alongside appliques made by the San Bias Indians, as well as contemporary fiber art. And in 1965, the Newark Museum exhibited optical quilts. And then in 1970, Rhode Island School of Design exhibited Mountain Artisans, and the piece on that is your left is some of the work that was seen there. And in addition, at this time, quilts received prominent attention when they appeared on the pages of Vogue in February of 1970, covering the ceilings, floors, tables, doors, and beds of Gloria Vanderbilt's Upper East Side home. Then, in 1971, Jonathan Holstein and Gail Vanderhoof used their art world connections to convince the Whitney Museum of American Art to host Abstract Design in American Quilts, an exhibit which featured 60 of their own quilts displayed on the large white walls of the newly opened Marcel Brauer-designed museum. Hanging on the walls of the Whitney was an Amish quilt, which you can see, let's see here if I can... This is an Amish quilt that they purchased for around $6 from an antiques shop on Route 30 in Lancaster County, if you're familiar with that area. The exhibit was hugely popular, praised by prominent art critics, and attended by thousands, with the museum selling out its catalog and extending the exhibit's run. The couple had begun to see quilts when they escaped New York City for the countryside of Bucks and Lancaster counties in Pennsylvania. They noticed, after seeing countless quilts, that these old bed covers looked like, quote, works of art. The objects appealed to them, not because they might serve as charming bed covers, but because they were, as Holstein later recalled, quote, attuned to modernism. They used this lens, their modern eye, to see in quilts something that 100 years before, when the quilts were made, was not necessarily apparent. Holstein and Vanderhoof saw old quilts pieced in vivid graphics as clairvoyant precursors to the abstract, minimalist, and pop art of the post-World War II era. Striped rainbow quilts recalled Kenneth Noland. Tumbling blocks predicted Vasarely's fascination with optical illusions. These quilts, created in 2 dimensions on a similar scale as the large works generated by New York abstract artists, were typically crafted 50 to 100 years earlier than their painted counterparts. Holstein and Vanderhoof had started proselytizing to their friends about the aesthetic merits of old bed coverings. And as Holstein recalled to me in an interview many years later, these artists immediately understood their perspective. And I'll quote from him here. "We took a group of slides down to show to our friends Roy and Dorothy Lichtenstein, and they were just gassed. And then I showed them to our friend Barnett Newman. Especially I wanted him to see the Amish quilts because of the nature of his work. And again, he was just gassed. Everyone we showed them to was totally overwhelmed by their power. So when practicing artists looked at them, they understood immediately what had been done. When we told people like Roy and Barney the dates of these, they were just gassed because they knew art history, and they knew that here were women making these things that in many ways anticipated some of the movements of modern art. And there was that thing. Well, how could this have happened? They were just these often unschooled women living in rural areas of the United States, far from the centers of culture. Well, how the hell did they pull this off? And that really was the issue for us, too. Accomplished artists understood this right away and understood what they were seeing. We didn't have to explain anything to Barney." End quote. Implicit in this reaction was the notion that art happened in the city, particularly in New York City, and not normally in the sewing rooms of rural America, and rarely by unschooled women. Yet decades earlier, women had created art that Holstein identified as predicting aspects of the current movements in abstract art. Holstein and Vanderhoof considered quilts works of art, but they had to convince their fellow members of the art world that the quilt's resemblance to paintings was not just an interesting coincidence, that quilts were worth exploring as visual objects in their own right. They did not argue that all quilts were related to various movements of modern art. They were quite selective about the quilts that they purchased and then chose to exhibit. They recognized particularly the graphic pieced quilts, like the one on the left. Those made from geometric pieces of cloth seemed together as the ones that, quote, provide a cohesive and strong visual statement, end quote. Applique quilts, like the one on the right, which is applique is the process of stitching a fabric down onto a background fabric and are often much more figurative, are, quote, usually more decorative and while often beautiful, seem to lack the stronger visual characteristics we see in pieced quilts, end quote. Like Clement Greenberg, the esteemed art critic who wielded immense influence on the interpretation of 20th century art, Holstein disdained the decorative in favor of the flatness and lack of ornamentation that characterized both the New York School of Art as well as many pieced quilts that he had been inquiring. Excuse me. In seeking to elevate pieced quilts to the status of art, Holstein had to convince others of his elite New York crowd that they were not mere craft. Holstein hypothesized that, quote, museum curators would say they belonged in institutions that showed craft and Americana. He argued that it was necessary to take a wide-angle lens view of quilts so that the viewer could, quote, strip away the awe of handwork, end quote, emphasizing the designed elements that could be seen from across a room rather than the technical skills, the fine stitching that could only be seen up close. He and Vanderhoof concentrated solely on what they described as great aesthetic merit rather than on workmanship or condition or age, which are the typical criteria of connoisseurship of the decorative arts. Only then, when the elements of the craft were ignored, could these quilts be, quote, elevated to the status of art. And to achieve that distance, they literally put quilts on walls, stood far away from them, and, quote, symbolically and actually took them from the setting of the bedroom and hung them on the wall. Viewing quilts as canvases enabled the graphic power rather than the minute quilting stitches to dominate. With this distinction between art and craft situated at the point of contemplation, which art demands cognition, whereas craft is merely decorative, Holstein and Vanderhoff had to display the quilts so that their formal aspects, such as the line and the form, the things that we look for in art, overshadowed their utilitarian, technical, or decorative aspects, their craftedness. And as the couple began to cull their quilt collection, prior to the Whitney Museum's exhibition, they spread the quilts out on the grass of Roy and Dorothy Lichtenstein's Long Island home, and they went to the roof so that they could fully appreciate the quilts with that kind of distance. When the Whitney agreed to host abstract design, quilts were certainly not an entirely new addition to the worlds of art, fashion, or consumer culture. What set the Whitney exhibit apart from these other quilt events, however, was the degree to which the media paid attention. The press in New York went nuts over the show, and once the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service launched its own traveling exhibition of the show called American Pieced Quilts, national periodicals, including Newsweek, Life, Reader's Digest, and others, jumped onto this quilt bandwagon, as did many regional newspapers near the smaller museums across the country where the Smithsonian exhibition traveled. More than anything, abstract design made quilts part of this national conversation in the 1970s. Holstein recalled later, quote, "The exhibition put quilts where they would be seen by the intellectual establishment." He was right. Led by Hilton Kramer, a New York Times art critic known for his relatively conservative views on art, critics in leading newspapers and magazines embraced the Whitney exhibit and the other exhibits that followed. Holstein felt vindicated when these prestigious critics understood his vision. One reviewer even elevated the quilts above the abstract art to which Holstein compared them, writing, quote, "These practical, useful quilts have a vitality that canvases created today for the elite and the intelligentsia frequently lack," end quote. Janet Malcolm, writing in The New Yorker, proclaimed that, quote, "Viewers were stunned by the strength and beauty of design achieved by hanging quilts on the big white walls of the museum as if they were paintings," end quote. Such critics, who usually focused on the paintings and sculpture that were displayed at museums and galleries, played a significant role in creating quilts' newfound status as art objects. In his review of the exhibit of abstract design, Hilton Kramer noted that the Whitney had, quote, "rarely condescended to acknowledge the decorative arts," he said in quotes, as they are called, "as a significant contribution to American artistic achievements." And he considered the exhibit a success not only visually, but because it, quote, "prompts us to rethink the relation of high art to what are customarily regarded as the lesser forms of visual expression." Kramer argued, quote, "This is an issue that any serious historian of American art is going to have to come to terms with in future dealings with his subject." Kramer's stature ensured that his thoughts on quilts would be widely read by members of the New York art scene, as well as around the country. If Kramer, who did not hesitate to offer harsh criticism when he saw fit, believed that quilts belonged at the Whitney, then many of his readers would be willing to give bed covers on walls a chance as well. One of the most significant responses to the exhibit was from feminists. Women across the country began projects as a direct response to abstract design in American quilts, emphasizing the role of quilts in women's lives rather than only the graphic elements and the links to modernist art. Feminist curators presented quilts as part of the life cycle of American women, along with primary sources documenting women's lives such as diaries and letters. These projects that address needlework not from just a good design standpoint or a modernist art perspective demonstrated that quilts were indeed beautiful, but that one could appreciate them as so much more than just as aestheticized objects, hung on white walls, treated like paintings. Feminist art historian Pat Minardi's 1973 article, "Quilts, the Great American Art," led the feminist response to exhibitions of needlework as art. Minardi not only issued her complaint that when displayed as works of art, quilts were detached from their historical context, she particularly took issue with the appropriation of quilts as art objects within a male modernist context, naming Jonathan Holstein, the curator of the Whitney exhibit, as the primary perpetrator. Quote, Because our female ancestors' pieced quilts bear a superficial resemblance to the work of contemporary formalist artists such as Stella, Noland, and Newman, she wrote, modern male curators and critics are now capable of seeing the art in them. She understood that needlework's significance was much different. She identified it as part of what she called a universal female art, in which, quote, women controlled the education of their daughters. Although Minorities' article was in part a response and specific critique of the Whitney's exhibit, it was also a feminist declaration that quilts were a vital part of women's artistic heritage. She bemoaned that quilts were, quote, omitted from all general reference within the history of art, just like jazz was underrated because the wrong people made it. As some feminist artists began to embrace quilts as their artistic heritage, the iconography of needlework, as well as its techniques, appeared in their own work. Artists trained in other media, such as Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago, utilized quilt making, embroidery, and other needle arts in their work, along with traditional feminine iconography. Projects such as The Artist and the Quilt, which paired women artists with needleworkers to make these sort of hybrid art needlework collages, started in the early 1970s and completed in 1982, were attempts at encouraging female visual artists to experiment with these traditional women's techniques. This effort, which resulted in a touring exhibition and catalog, united women on different ends of this sort of art craft spectrum to create work together. Women artists and art critics developed a renewed appreciation for traditional women's crafts such as weaving, embroidery, and basketry. Through feminist artists and feminist art criticism, many of these crafts became validated as, quote, art, specifically as women's art that could make both a powerful visual statement and be empowering. This is during the same time period as consciousness-raising groups are taking hold, and sometimes they're working on needlework at these very same groups. Exemplifying this new status is the 1983 statement by Miriam Shapiro, both a feminist and an artist. She wrote, "Only now is quilt's significance as an indigenous American art form created exclusively by women beginning to be recognized. The quilting tradition illuminates the darkness of women's history like a torch, showing us the strength and power of women as artist makers and the consolidation of women as a sharing community." Shapiro was a leading feminist artist who co-created the first feminist arts program, which was at Cal Arts in Los Angeles. And she lectured widely using slides of traditional women's crafts, advocating that these works be rewritten into the art canon that had marginalized them. As part of the pattern and decoration movement, she incorporated needlework methods and fabric into her work, which she called femage. And here's a great example of that. One of Shapiro's early collaborators was Judy Chicago, who similarly drew on women's traditional art forms to make a bold feminist art statement. And here we see The Dinner Party, her most well-known installation piece, which was first exhibited in 1979 and integrated traditional needlework techniques into dinner place settings celebrating noted women throughout history. And in these ways, feminists embraced various forms of needlework as art, but in a way that contrasted with what the Whitney's abstract design in American quilts had done. It did not take on this modernist approach, emphasizing strong design alone. Seeing or hearing about the Whitney's exhibit also prompted some women to create their own alternative exhibitions of quilts in response that emphasized the role of quilts in women's lives rather than focusing on aesthetics. When a group of women in the Bay Area in California heard about the hoopla surrounding the exhibit in New York, they were very determined to take action. Julie Silber, along with friends Pat Ferraro and Linda Ruther, who had also begun to collect quilts on the West Coast, they'd made their own discovery in the mid-1960s and had been buying quilts similarly to Holstein and Vanderhoof on the East Coast. They countered with their own exhibit, demonstrating how these objects could enrich and validate the stories from historical women's lives. They agreed that quilts looked great hanging on walls because of their graphic qualities, but they viewed quilts as an entree into women's history, a new and underexplored field of study. And this is right around the same time when women's studies programs and women's history is taking off in the academy as well. They organized and curated Quilts in Women's Lives, a 1976 exhibit hosted by the Emanuel Walter Gallery of the San Francisco Art Institute. Silber recalled this small exhibit as very much a direct and specific response to the Whitney exhibit, which they perceived as a male way of viewing quilts, with aesthetics overshadowing all other significant aspects of the needlework. Rather than isolating the quilts on white walls, they used quilts to present the life cycle of 19th century women, complementing the quilts with quotes from women's letters, journals, and biographies. And the exhibit was very small. The critical response was great, and these three women began formulating a much larger exhibit, the catalog of which you see here, the 1981 American Quilts, A Handmade Legacy, which opened at the Oakland Museum and attracted 120,000 visitors in 3 months, breaking the previous attendance records for that museum. The quilts themselves contrasted with the type of quilts that Holstein and Vanderhoef had showed at the Whitney. These quilts were stories, had stories embedded in the stitches or inked inscriptions that replaced those quilts that were solely intended to look like paintings. Whereas the catalog to the Whitney exhibit pictured quilts floating like stretched canvases on the pages of the book with little accompanying text, the Oakland exhibit's catalog included interpretive essays, stereoscopic images of women with their quilts from the 19th century, excerpts from the diaries, and detailed images that allowed readers to see the craftsmanship of the individual stitches, as well as the overall aesthetic elements of the quilts. To these curators, quilts were one of many types of cultural documents that could help elucidate women's history. Patricia Cooper and Norma Bradley Buford attended the Whitney exhibit in 1971 and, quote, recognized that the show signaled a renewed interest in quilts, especially quilts as an art form, end quote. These women lived in New Mexico in the Southwest, and they had learned themselves to piece quilts as children and cherished their own family's quilts. They didn't need to be taught a newfound appreciation for these objects. But again, by seeing quilts embraced by an art museum, they were inspired to create their own project. They began collecting quilts in the Southwest, and they also began interviewing women who were still alive who had made these quilts. They loved the boldness and graphic designs, just as the curators at the Whitney did. But as they collected and looked at quilts, they began to develop theories about the role of quilts in women's lives, and they wrote, quote, the best elements of teaching were often combined over the construction of a quilt. Early and often, loving instruction, tradition, discipline, planning, and completing a task, moral reinforcement. Quilting was a virtue. Sorry, get my timer back on here. They launched an oral history project in which they talked to around 30 different women. They participated in quilting bees, and they listened to the quiltmakers' stories. Cooper and Buford recorded their stories in a 1977 book, The Quilters, Women and Domestic Art, integrating women's quilt making into a cultural history of New Mexican and Texas women. And if you're familiar with The Quilters, the musical, was based on this project as well. Other feminists embraced quilt making as art by encouraging women who had made quilts to consider themselves as artists rather than someone who was just making a bed cover. Jean Ray Laurie was an academically trained artist, and she started making quilts in the late 1950s, long before this craze for quilts had begun to occur in the 1970s. She began teaching and writing about quilts in the 60s, publishing quilt patterns in magazines such as House Beautiful and Women's Day, and she published her own guidebooks. Laurie understood the chasm that divided high art from crafts and considered quilts a means to, quote, bridge the gulf between art and craft. Similarly, espousing that women could be artists as well as mothers and wives. To Laurie, the process of making quilts could be akin to other sorts of consciousness-raising activities that were popular by the 1970s. among various feminists. And you can see here, if you can see the writing directly on this quilt, you can see the very feminist take that she has on history. Through Lori's writing and teaching, many women discovered that quilt making was indeed an artistic practice that allowed for emotional expression and political statements. As quilt makers inspired by Lori embraced their artistic abilities, the status of quilts again shifted in their minds from that of just a traditional craft to a contemporary form of art. So these cultural currents swirling both prior to and after this landmark exhibit, Abstract Design in American Quilts, played a significant role in the shifting status of this form of needlework within the museum. New perceptions of the importance of handmade objects, a feminist reclamation of needlework from drudgery to art form, and an awareness of contemporary women making quilts as a means of escaping poverty all factored into this growing buzz. After receiving relatively little attention since the folk art and colonial revival craze of the 1920s and 30s, quilts were indeed displayed in those early period rooms in the American wing, but not at all on walls. They were displayed as bed coverings. This new limelight only increased in the years surrounding the American bicentennial because of nostalgic nationalism centered on an imagined colonial past. I want to close today's talk thinking about a recent acquisition to the Biggs Museum in the context of some of the more recent developments in the collection here at the Biggs, and how we exhibit traditional women's arts. Echoing the craze for quilts that occurred in the early 1970s, in the early 2000s, quilts made by African American women in a remote enclave in rural Alabama became a national phenomenon with the touring of a landmark exhibition, The Quilts of Gee's Bend. It shared similarities with the Whitney's 1971 Abstract Design in American Quilts, and that it was organized as a, quote, discovery of a new object by a well-connected art world collector, in this case, William Arnett. And he had pitched the exhibit to an art museum, in this case, the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. That initial exhibit traveled extensively. Did any of you ever see Gee's Bend quilts exhibited somewhere? They've been many, many places, and there's been subsequent iterations and other groups of Gee's Bend quilts. And as of this past summer, several quilts by Gee's Bend makers were on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and actually had been acquired by the collection. And what I found very significant, they were displayed right adjacent to a room full of Rothkos. I am absolutely enthralled by these quilts. I love these quilts, as do many museum goers. They're really powerful visual works of art. But it still frustrates me that traditional women's arts that receive the most attention are the ones that look the most like paintings, that look like these abstractions, rather than ones that where it's the craftsmanship or other qualities, the connection to the traditional craft that are brought to the forefront. Don't get me wrong, these are among my favorite objects to look at. Recently, the Biggs Museum acquired a quilt by artist Ann B. Martin. This morning, Ryan was talking about the great partnership with the African American community here in the surrounding area outside of Dover. And how many artists came and exhibited their work here in this museum. And this acquisition was made after that exhibition last February, as part of the African American History Live, which was part of the larger Dover citywide Black History celebration. So this quilt, unlike those made by the Gee's Bend quilt makers, which have received far more fame, or the quilts that were displayed prominently in the 1970s, would much more fall into the decorative camp, if we're talking about this line, this hierarchy between decorative and abstraction. Although I hope it's clear that I don't really buy into those hierarchies. No curator or collector would claim that this one looks like a painting. It's that comparison wouldn't necessarily be made. But in many ways, this is what makes the object fit so well into the Biggs collection, and that it shares elements with the handful of embroidered schoolgirl samplers that the Biggs collection already has, and which it has championed through its leadership in the Sampler Consortium, which is a national sort of index and archive of known needlepoint samplers in various private and public collections throughout the country. The quilt draws on the imagery made popular from the book Hidden in Plain View, which suggests, based on one family's oral tradition, that during slavery, the Underground Railroad used a quilt code to help those fleeing slavery identify safe houses, with a code stitched into quilt patterns guiding people north to freedom. This book has proved to be very controversial, with quilt historians widely debunking its theory because the patterns purported to be used were not in use during the antebellum era, because of geographic discrepancies in how the Underground Railroad actually functioned, and largely because no other evidence exists in either the oral, written, or material record that supports this quilt code having existed. But I'm not here today to debate whether the Underground Railroad quilt code, as it is known, existed or not. But I want to talk about this quilt as such a great recent acquisition because it exemplifies a contemporary form of traditional women's work that is rooted equally in myth, folklore, and history. Today, women do not learn the skills of needlework as a matter of course, as many did in the 18th or 19th century. Cutting up fabric to sew it back together again is a very impractical hobby. Yet quilt making is now a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States. The quilt draws on this debunked myth, or as I prefer to call it, one family's folklore of the quilt code. But more importantly, it is whimsical and creative, with printed novelty cloth carefully cut out to showcase chickens, corn, cow, and other imagery. It features fabric, paint, lace, and actual working bell. Would this quilt fit into the highly curated chronological galleries of American art upstairs? Not really. Would it fit into one of those late 1960s or 1970s exhibits that began to showcase needlework in art contexts? No, it wouldn't fit there either. But it is a contemporary piece of art that reflects current trends in quilt making and is much more representative of its time than a Geesben quilt is of its. When we walk through the galleries of decorative arts and paintings upstairs, those two are pieces intended to be exemplary of their time. And in this way, Ann Martin's quilt fits right in here at the Biggs Museum. And I hope that the museum continues to acquire objects that fit the spirit of the larger collection in this way. Thank you so much.